So again, welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Hunter Peterson. I'm the clinic director at Coeur d'Alene Healing Arts. And this is monthly virtual open forum when myself and some of the other doctors at our clinic get together and talk about various health topics and hopefully things that each of you can learn a little bit from and, kind of bring to your life in helpful ways with your health. So today I'm going to be covering the topic of the wonderful gut and some of the many things we can learn about it and the many important roles it plays in our health, both when functioning appropriately and then when functioning in a compromised fashion and some of the consequences of that. So I think as we go through this process, the best way to kind of maybe drop questions that you may want me to expand on or go in a different direction or just what you kind of brought to learn about, feel free to use the chat function. There's a little chat icon on the bottom bar that you can type questions into. And that way we can kind of just, make this time, because we only have about 45 minutes, more efficient and yet still get to your questions. So I thought that a really good way to start the meeting would be to teach a little bit about, what is our digestive system? What does it do? Why do we have it evolutionarily? And kind of how it works. So I'm just going to do a quick rundown of the different organs that are associated or part of the digestive system. And I think that, it's pretty obvious to most, but the primary role of our digestive function is to have us break down and then absorb nutrients into our bloodstream that goes to our tissues to essentially sustain life from the standpoint that we're constantly needing to regenerate and build structures and tissues in our body, and that the building blocks of that are the nutrients we get from our foods, that we are not like plants. We cannot make energy and make structure from sunlight. We actually have to consume things from nature in order to sustain our life. And so that process comes through our digestive system, and that's a very intricate and complex process. So the beginning of things is when we put something in our mouth, and actually before we even put something in our mouth, when we smell food we're preparing, that starts to kick off a bunch of digestive juices dropping into our intestinal lining. But when we start to eat food, we chew it up, and that process of chewing does two major functions. It breaks food down into smaller sizes so that our enzymes in our gut can get more access to those foods and break them down more completely. And it also involves saliva, which helps coat the foods, but also importantly helps begin the process of carbohydrate breakdown. Three main constituents in our food that we derive energy from: carbohydrate, fat, and protein. And so a lot of that carbohydrate digestion actually starts in the mouth, up to 60% of it, in fact, by the enzymes in our saliva. So why it's such a big thing that us naturopaths talk about, chewing your food and taking your time, is because increasing that surface area of food as well as getting that process of digestion initiated is very important and helpful. Once we've hopefully chewed everything up into liquid, we swallow, and then from that point of digestion, everything in terms of how the food moves through your system becomes involuntary, meaning our brains do not control those muscles. It kind of does its own thing. And so everything slides down the esophagus, which is the tube between your mouth and your stomach. And then at the top of the stomach, there's a little sphincter called the lower esophageal sphincter that opens up in coordination with when we swallow food or beverages. And then it closes back down. And the reason it needs to do that is because our stomach is highly, highly acidic. And that's The only part of our body that is so, the rest of our body is a very neutral acid-base balance, a pH of around 7.5, but our stomach has a pH of around 1 or 2, which means it's very good at a few things. It's very good at extracting minerals and vitamins. That low pH allows us to break proteins down, and that low pH allows us to kill pathogens that we're bringing in through our mouth or with our food. A lot of folks have really compromised stomach acid, and therefore a lot of those things I mentioned the stomach's designed to do, it doesn't do such a good job of, and that can become a real problem. So the stomach, food sits in there for about 45 minutes on average, swashes around, and you're starting to unzip those proteins and extract those minerals and vitamins. And then after that time, it drops into the small intestine, which is the primary organ in the digestive tube that is responsible for really fully digesting the remainder of our foods, but also absorbing our foods and liquids. So the process of absorption happens in that small intestine. And it turns out that there's a lot of space over which that happens. The small intestine is almost 25 feet long. And even more importantly, besides just the length of that tube all coiled up, it has what are called microvilli, which are these finger-like projections that come off of its surface that increase its surface area millions and millions of times what it would be otherwise. And therefore, if you spread the surface area of your small intestine out, it would actually be the size of a football field. So very massive absorptive surface. That section of the gut is also where some of the supportive organs of digestion drop all of their secretions in to help break down our foods. So those three main organs that I'm thinking about are the liver / gallbladder. The gallbladder is a storage tank for the liver bile, which is what helps us assimilate and absorb fats. Bile is also a big way that we get rid of waste products and detox products from our liver. And then we have the pancreas, which is right there, and it secretes enzymes to break down proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. So lots of protein or lots of enzymatic stuff comes out of the pancreas to support that process. And so those are kind of, our main active organs of digestion from the standpoint of secretions to help fully break down our foods. Going back to the small intestine, so over this period of space, there's a whole lot more going on in the small intestine. So one thing that is a big conversation that we're going to talk about today is this is the beginning to where you really start to see microbes pop into your gut that live there for our entire lives. This is what we call the gut microbiome. And it's a rich tapestry of organisms, primarily bacteria, but also fungal species, also parasitic species. And they reside in our gut and play crucial roles in the process of digestion. They actually make some of our vitamins. They actually break down some of our foods more completely. And they do a critical role of protecting the lining of the intestines and actually feeding the lining of the intestines. The metabolic byproducts of those microbes make sure the intestinal lining stays really healthy. And it turns out that's a pretty big deal because the lining of our small intestine is 1 cell thick. So if those cells get irritated and they get damaged, then you start to have big patches and holes in your intestinal lining, and you get eventually this term called leaky gut, we've heard, or intestinal permeability. And then your barrier between the gut tube and your bloodstream and tissues is totally blown open, and lots of toxins can enter the bloodstream, lots of undigested foods, lots of immune dysregulatory processes can happen. And so we can probably get to talking more about that, but this is a very critical, dysfunction to understand and be aware of that is probably, I mean, I would say as a naturopathic doctor, one of the single most, if not the single most biggest driver of inflammation and dysfunction systemically in our body is this concept that pathogens and incompletely digested foods get into our bloodstream because of a compromised intestinal membrane or lining. So just want to kind of bring that up and that possibility. The small intestine is also a really majorly important place where our immune system resides. There's actually about half of our immune cells are associated with primarily the lower half of the small intestine. And there's this stuff called gut-associated lymphatic tissue. And it's really important to understand that that tissue is interfacing with our microbes in our gut. That's a lot of the interface that is causing our immune system to behave systemically as it does. So again, a huge interface of the gut physiology to systemic physiology is the appropriateness of that interface between the gut microbiome and the 50% of our immune system that's associated with the gut is hugely important to how our immune system behaves globally in our body. So a really dysregulated microbiome and dysregulated internal gut process leads to a very dysregulated immune function. It's why when I'm treating things like allergies and asthma and eczema, the main focus of the underlying root cause of it that, in my opinion, needs to be addressed is a dysregulated immune system based on a dysregulated interface going on at the gut level. Allergies and asthma are examples of conditions where the immune system is hyper responsive and hyper reactive to benign compounds in our environment. So another little interplay there systemically. The food that's in our small intestine sits there for about 6 to 8 hours. And then after it makes its way all the way down through that involuntary muscle to what's called the Ileocecal Valve, there's a little valve that opens up and allows food or the waste products that you have not absorbed, which is a lot of fiber, but it's also some of that bile and other indigestible things, from the small intestine into the large intestine or the colon. Now, this organ is only 3 or 4 feet long, but it's a lot broader in diameter. It's about 3 to 4 inches wide. And it also has dramatically more microbes living in it. I mean, orders of magnitude more. And so this is the place where the majority of our gut microbiome bugs live. And so that's why there's that sphincter there to keep those microbes primarily in the large intestine versus the small intestine. Now, there's another condition that we often find where a lot of those bugs leak back into the small intestine, that we call that bacterial overgrowth of the small intestine. It can be a real issue for a lot of folks. But getting back to the colon, the real process going on in the colon is there's a little bit further digestion of compounds from our food by the bugs that live there, and they're extracting some more vitamins and they're extracting some more nutrients, and those can be absorbed. And there's also the final absorption of liquids or water that moves the waste products from a liquid state to a solid state as the food goes from our ascending to transverse to descending colon. And then at the very end of that, there's the rectum, where the voluntary muscles of digestion and elimination come back, and we eliminate in that way. For a healthy person, anywhere from 1 to 3 times a day. Now, that time it takes for food to go through the large intestine is about 18 to 24 hours. So things actually stay there for longer. And one of the big things you can actually do to assess digestive function is measure people's transit time and see how efficiently food is moving through the system, or if it's moving too quickly through the system. So in kind of a whirlwind summary, that is the physiology of our gut from a digestive standpoint and how it functions. And then, of course, all of the downstream parts of that is how those nutrients get distributed. And what they start to do is they go into our lymphatic circulatory system, and they first and foremost get dumped off into the liver. And then our liver starts to repackage things and shuttle them around to different tissues where they can be used as energy, burned as fuel, stored, used to rebuild and regenerate tissues, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, that goes all over our body. Now, when we are talking about some of the other roles the gut plays, because I want to stay on the healthy physiology of the gut, it's important to identify some of the things it does. So we already talked about that immune interface. That's a really big one. Another thing that the gut plays a huge role in is the generation of really crucial molecules associated with cognitive functioning. So it plays a major role in making neurotransmitters, for example, making hormones. Everyone's heard of serotonin, or maybe SSRI medications stand for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Well, over 60% of your serotonin is made in the gut. So those gut-associated cells are actually generating those hormones. So lots to that process. And I could go on and on, but I think I will just pause from there and kind of go into the story of, how does our gut get set up for success? And the real starting point of that is in childbirth. It turns out that, of course, in the womb, we are basically sterile in the placenta, but when we're born through the vaginal canal, you get exposed to the flora that's in mother's vaginal tract. And that flora is what starts to seed our microbiome of all the rich carpet of bugs that end up living there. And so as we grow and develop, breast milk and the healthiness and appropriateness of the breast milk shapes that. And then eventually we start to introduce solid foods, and that starts to influence the shape and dynamic of those microbes in the gut. And then we start to, deal with the other really critical part of being human, which is what is the master orchestrator of our tissue functions, which via the neurological system or nervous system ultimately is the brain. So as a very holistic naturopathic doctor, I always have to pause and talk about how critical this interface is between the gut-brain connection. And just as the gut makes all of these compounds for the brain, and when the gut's inflamed, it makes the brain inflamed, right? Which can really cause cognitive issues and problems with how the brain functions. Equally, if not more important, is the brain's influence on the gut function. And so, very importantly, I want to acknowledge the role of basically how our mind operates in either nurturing the healthy function of digestion or really inhibiting healthy function of digestion. And we actually have terms for this that everyone's pretty familiar with: fight or flight and rest and digest. And those terms have to do with the two different tones of your autonomic nervous system that either brings nerve supply and blood flow to the organs of digestion, or redirects blood flow and nerve supply away from them to the peripheral organs and brain. So the rest and digest response obviously is the one that bring it there, and the fight or flight removes that tone. When that tone is a fight or flight is chronically activated, we start to create a really problematic situation for our digestive function, because essentially all of the blood flow and nerve supply required to support the gut flora, to support the secretion of enzymes and constituents to break down our foods, the blood flow that helps nourish the intestinal lining and ensure its health, the blood flow that puts acid in our stomach and the secretions there, all basically get shut down. The muscles that propel our food in a very sequential way through our system start to either go into spasm or shut down. And so the chronic stress response is very, very detrimental to our digestive health. And in my experience as a clinician and as treating folks who come to me wanting to work on their gut health and just general overall health, this issue is perhaps above and beyond any other issue, one of the thing that leads to diminished health. Because if we are not bringing proper tone to our digestive process and we're generating all these deficiencies, depletions in breakdown and absorption, and we're activating all sorts of inflammation and leakiness and immune dysregulation, this, as you can imagine, can lead to all sorts of implications locally in the gut as well as systemically. And so one of the more fundamental elements that I think is invited into almost every visit I have is really appreciating someone's state of being, the time and energy they allocate to the hygiene of eating, but also the things and ways in which they are unconscious or conscious of stressors that are held onto and constantly triggering the brain to secrete this message that they need to fight or flight. And so a lot of therapeutics that I consider too are designed to work on this tone. One of my favorite practices is the Castor Oil Pack, which is to take a cotton flannel, saturate it with castor oil, and then apply it across the abdomen with a little heat source over it, which is a fantastic long tradition tool for bringing better blood supply and nervous tone to the gut. And it's a very, very powerful medicine. I encourage any of you to try it, even if you don't per se have gut issues, just to notice how much it activates those organs in that process. Breath work, it turns out, is really, really helpful. Deep belly breathing massages the nerves that activate the process of rest and digest. And furthermore, when you focus on your breathing or you do meditation or mindfulness-based movement like yoga and Tai Chi, you're essentially letting all the busy, stressful activities of the mind quiet down, which in turn brings more tone to the digestive process. So again, I kind of lead there in some ways in our conversation because it's very easy for for us all to think, oh, the quality and efficiency of our digestion is all about what we eat. No, it has everything to do, just as much, if not more so, with the state of our being. And we live in a culture and a society that is very busy, very overstimulated, over demanding of engagement of our minds, over technology driven, which is not good for that rest and digest tone. We need times of stillness, time in nature, times of connection with each other, tangibly in person. These are really good ways to facilitate a much more peaceful, grounded state. And that's so important to healthy digestion and healthy gut function. So as you can imagine, a lot of sessions explore that in more depth in our care and use various tools also to work in that plane of one's existence and well-being. And another interesting integration, of course, if we're going to transition into nutrition and discuss how it affects the gut, is that, as many of you can probably testify, all of our relationships with food are not simply a logical, conscious process that we say, oh, we are going to eat the foods we know that are best for us in the proper quantities and the proper times. We all recognize that our emotional, mental state and stress levels for most people influence our eating patterns. And many of us have a tendency to soothe or kind of, I guess, use food as something of a resource for, I guess, de-stressing us. Even though it's not the best resource, many of us have learned and developed ways to do so. So that's an interesting interplay where we can, educate on nutrition until we're blue in the face, but if we don't actually understand the underlying driving forces of what compels our unconscious way we relate to food, then we're not really ever going to make meaningful, sustained inroads or achieve cures. So good to be conscious of that reality too. Now, in terms of some of the other forces that can really affect the gut, it's not just stress and it's not just what we eat. It's also things in our environment can really affect the gut. And actually, interventions medically can affect the gut pretty strongly. So I want to bring up two classes of medications that tend to be really destructive to sustaining good gut health. And the first is antibiotics. For a very obvious reason, antibiotics are designed to kill off infections, but they're non-specific. So they turn out that those antibiotics you take orally kill a bunch of the bugs in our gut that are there to protect us and open the door potentially to other pathogenic microbes that can cause us issues. So I'm really not a fan of using those types of tools unless it's a very necessary last resort. Our medical system does not use antibiotics as such, and therefore a lot of people get antibiotics when there are other really reasonable, better solutions to infectious issues they're having. Another class of compounds that can be really detrimental to the gut is the class called steroids. And steroids are a medication that conventional doctors prescribe for pretty much any kind of ailment. And because most ailments, most symptoms we experience are the consequence of inflammation and of a really revved up, activated immune response. So what steroids do is they shut down our immune system, which of course has its own problems. We have an immune system for a good reason, but often that will shut down the inflammatory process. The problem there again is that they influence a lot of other systems in our body. They influence blood flow to the gut. They influence nerve supply to the gut. They influence the health of the microbiome in the gut. And so chronic use of steroids can be a real issue for people's guts and cause real significant setbacks. So I wanted to mention a couple of medication classes, and there are many, many more that affect the gut. Another really ubiquitous one is ibuprofen, right? Things like Advil. Those are very tough on the stomach lining particularly. Another form of medication that's very ironically a medication used for the gut is one in the long term that causes very significant gut and systemic issues, which are antacids or acid blocking medications, which is kind of ubiquitously given to patients for any digestive ailment of any type. And the problem there is it shuts down our stomach acid, which we need to break down and assimilate our foods and protect us against pathogens. So while they might sometimes give symptom relief from something like heartburn, in the long term, they set us up with much bigger issues. And we've seen that now with the research of things like dementia and cancer and heart disease risk for long-term users of those drugs. So lots of better ways to approach some of these patterns than using those drugs. And I'm always very aggressive, if I can be, with helping my patients get off of them because of them being in themselves obstacles to healing. So I guess I would like to kind of move forward a little bit to talk about the interface of our nutrition with our gut function, because obviously the foods we're putting in our body are going to influence how appropriately and efficiently our gut behaves. And so I think it's a really good place to kind of draw into history here to kind of show where we've come from versus where we are now, to understand why we're in such a challenging situation with our guts. You know, we have the stress side in the way of being a modern human. That's one thing that's really different. But we also have this dramatic departure in the actual substances we put in our body and consume as fuel. Our ancestors ate, of course, things that were basically either grown directly in their backyard in nature in healthy soils that were not depleted, and they were primarily foods that were very high in dietary fiber. They were fibrous vegetables, fibrous grains, fibrous beans, fibrous fruits, with very small, so whole foods, right? The entire food was being consumed with very small amounts of animal compounds, say eggs, say little bits of meat, little bits of seafood, little bits of dairy, right? But we're talking like, 10, 15% of the diet, depending on culture, and region of the ecosystem. So important to understand too that those ancestral peoples, they didn't eat as much as we do. I mean, they would go days on end without finding food or having food. They might eat sparingly once or twice a day. So it's really helpful to know that our systems are really designed well to go longer, prolonged periods without food, and to be overall having a much lower caloric intake than we currently do. And that's actually important because when I'm healing guts with people that have really inflamed, degenerative, chronic issues, my favorite tool is to deploy fasting, because fasting, by withholding food, is actually an incredible way to rest the gut and allow it to regenerate appropriately. So this kind of idea that most standard American diets are people eating kind of constantly throughout the day really doesn't work when we're trying to repair the gut, or it really can get in the way. So our ancestral diet was high in whole plants and high fibers, which again, those fibers in terms of physiologically, I haven't taught much about them, but a huge importance of that fiber is it's one of the main things that keeps our gut bugs in balance and happy and healthy. And what I mean by in balance is the microbes that protect the gut lining, that help break down our foods, that help, make a healthy immune interface. They really do well on a really high fiber diet. The microbes that cause toxins and inflammation and dysregulate our immune system and harm our gut and tissues, they like really starchy, refined, processed, sugary types of foods, which, I mean, obviously where I'm headed here, everyone knows that, of course, one of the big tragedies about modern living is the rapid transformation of our nutrition and the amplification of processed, fiber stripped, refined foods that have been depleted of fiber and minerals and nutrients, above and beyond the practical fact that our soils in general are depleted of nutrients. So we are not getting the nourishment that our ancestors did or that we need. So that intake of that high starch, high sugar, high processed, preservatives, many ingredient, boxed, packaged foods is that it drives a degradatory process in the gut that leads to dysregulated microbiome, that leads to inflammation and compromised barrier function, that leads to systemic, dysfunction. And the propensity for us all to do that, it's pretty tough when, we've subsidized these processed toxic foods. We've keyed their ingredients in a way that they essentially feel to our body to kind of trigger those core cravings of craving for sweet, salt, and fat, which ancestrally was exquisitely rare to find in our environment. So we're hardwired to crave it because it's such a rare part of our ancestral diet. Well, now it's ubiquitous, constantly available, and actually it costs more money to eat whole fibrous foods and vegetables and fruits than it does to eat these processed foods. So for most of our society, it's a simple economic survival thing to get the calories and nourishment we need, even though we're getting depleted of minerals and vitamins we need, but to actually get the calories we need, we're resorting to all these processed foods. And of course, because we have hunger, craving, reward pathways, we're becoming addicted to them. So it's really hard to stop them once we're, really advanced down that path of being used to them and craving them. anyways, so this is kind of the way that we start to develop dysfunction in our digestive system as a result of this process, and really on the gut level, the way that that disrupts the microbiome and leads to inflammatory processes. And so if you extend outward of what kind of health dysfunctions that can cause, well, you have the obvious ones that are gut mediated. You got bloating and diarrhea and constipation and belly aches and heartburn and all those things. You could develop those into serious pathologies like Crohn's disease or inflammatory bowel disease, which sadly many more and more people have. But then you have the more systemic things that come of this. So when the body starts having a leaky lining in the gut and the immune system starts to get all dysregulated, all sorts of problems happen. All these toxins that are getting absorbed in the bloodstream, the body's got to do something with it. Well, depending on people's unique susceptibilities, it does different things with it. People that are predisposed to arthritis, those toxins and inflammatory byproducts go to the joints. People are predisposed to migraines, those will go into expressing migraines. People predisposed to sinus infections and ear infections, those will get pushed out into those mucous membranes. And in fact, 98% of childhood earaches that I treat are due to reactivities in the gut to foods that are inappropriate to someone's design. Seasonal allergies, asthma, fatigue, dysregulated immunity, right? Weakened immune system because the immune system gets all of its intelligence and strength from that gut interplay. Abnormal menstrual cycles, irritability, fatigue, brain fog, huge symptoms, hypoglycemia and reactive issues with blood sugar regulation, very prominent. And so, the list could basically go on what arises from this GI or gut dysfunction. So, suffice to say that, yes, most naturopathic doctors are big nerds about what's going on in the gut and how to take care of the gut. But I think there's good reason for it. And maybe we are more so biased than others. But certainly in my clinical practice, it is always valuable to work on the gut function and improve it and seek from those twofold main areas, nutritionally, as well as the interface of the stress response pattern, how to improve that part of our physiology and function. And in doing so, we often see chronic patterns of disturbance improve and even resolve entirely, not just in the gut, but systemically. So I wanted to share just kind of, of course, that more physiological understanding of things. And some of you are probably really interested, well, what can you do about the gut? And are there any medicinals that are going to help your gut, work better? And I'm happy to share a little bit about that for a few minutes. So nutritionally, there's a lot of ways to quote unquote skin a cat here, and we're all individual. So there is no universal nutritional approach I'm going to tell people. The universal thing I will say is eating whole foods, primarily plant-based, reduction of processed foods and labeled boxed foods, reduction of animal proteins, especially red meat and dairy, generally is a very, very good and helpful thing that everyone would benefit from. From there, we got to nuance things based on what's going on with someone's health, what someone's genetics and predispositions are, and use those things more to identify how to guide someone's nutritional path. Now, I particularly in my practice utilize the science of blood type and blood group to guide an initial understanding of people's digestive design. Eat Right for Your Blood Type is kind of the popularized book, but all of my patients will know that we usually are on that first visit, if we don't know it, finding out what someone's blood type is and kind of integrating that information to some degree into the guidances being given. And I'm not going to go into that today, although if you want to learn about that, I have videos on our website that I talk in way more detail about that. There are also gut healing nutritional guidances that I will do with folks. And those range from juice fasts and juice detoxes, which are, modified fasts that are completely plant-based, to, on the other end of the spectrum, something called the specific carbohydrate diet, which is heavily animal product based and has to do with drinking lots and eating a lot of bone broths and cooked down meats and removing refined fermentable starches that the gut bugs can feed off of. And so really good for imbalanced flora. So nutritionally, those are some of the things I think about. But equally important, I think about not overeating. I think about, eating in a relaxed environment, chewing your food. These are really basic, important principles, eating less frequently, that a lot of us forget are so helpful. Then on the other side of the equation, right, we are definitely looking at the neurological tone and how to improve tone, blood supply, nerve supply to the digestive system. One great way to help with that is actually a procedure called Colonics, which we work with a colonic hydrotherapist here in our clinic. They do water infusions into the colon to help reactivate those muscles and rebalance, remove toxins from the colon. We will also use basically efforts to improve enzymatic and stomach acid output to enhance the efficiency of digestion. So beyond the lifestyle things, we'll often use digestive bitter, hydrochloric acid for the stomach. We'll use pancreatic enzymes for the pancreas. We'll use emulsifying agents for the liver and gallbladder. These can be very useful tools in understanding things and in facilitating more complete digestion. Sometimes also, we have to recognize the microbiome is really dysregulated, and those pathogens that have kind of established themselves in the intestinal lining are creating a lot of problems. So I'll actually often, in those cases, use herbal antimicrobials, things with golden seal, wormwood, garlic, berberis, some of these various antimicrobial herbs to actually get rid of those parasites, bacteria, fungus. Oregano oil is a good one for fungus, just things that are pathogenic that have really overgrown in the gut lining. And then sometimes when appropriate, we want to re-inoculate with healthy bugs. So I recommend lots of ferments like sauerkraut and kimchi, really clean fermented yogurts. Those are really great for re-inoculating the gut with good bugs. Sometimes we'll use professional grade probiotics to help seed the gut. Those can be really helpful. And we will also do things often to help repair the lining itself in a damaged gut. So we will do things like L-glutamine is a really great amino acid to help with that. Slippery elm is a great herb for that, to support that. DGL or deglycerized licorice can do a great job there. Marshmallow. We can also use bone broths, which I talked about nutritionally in the GAPS diet, great for repairing the lining. So these are kind of all the tools, some of the tools, depending on the unique situation, the circumstance, we might deploy. Now, it's also true that sometimes we might not just gather exactly what's going on from taking a really good clinical history and understanding the patient's symptoms and background. In those cases, we have lots of very useful tools to assess. We have a stool test we can run to actually kind of examine the DNA fragments of all of the bacteria, microbes, parasites, fungus that might be in someone's gut and the balance of those. We can look at permeability function in that test. We can look at digestive output in that test. We can look at inflammation in the gut in that test. It's called a GI map. I do run that on occasion. It's a little spendy, so it's kind of only in cases for me where I'm a bit stuck on what I think's going on. We can also do a test with breath, breathing into a tube for overgrowth of bacteria into our small intestine. The condition's called SIBO. We can also do additional tests for food allergies for really determining uniquely what someone is reacting to in the foods they're consuming, and that's just a little finger prick test. We can refer also for more advanced kind of interventive testing, like putting a camera down into someone's stomach or putting a camera up someone's colon. Those are rare circumstances and tend to use those as a last resort, but they're also available to us. And if needed, of course, we have the prescription medications, but I don't even know if I could count on one hand the number of times I've suggested or prescribed those types of treatments, because I do feel as naturopathic physicians, we have such a good repertoire to work off of in terms of helping people heal and balance the function of their gut. So I've just been talking really fast for about 45 minutes. I guess I'm going to just take a quick moment and have, if anybody wants to zip off any questions of what they were hoping they might hear me talk about. I feel like that's a fairly good pausing point for me to kind of give you all a little backdrop and kind of share a little bit about my philosophy and my passion about the gut and its role in health. So anything that anybody want to add question-wise? And if not...
Dr. Peterson, I have a question. I have a daughter that just gave birth to my grandson, sure. And they did cesarean. Now, you mentioned that if there's a vaginal delivery, that the child is going to get some, I don't know, I don't remember how you described it, from the mother.
Yeah.
Is there procedures that the OBGYN does after the delivery of a cesarean that they try to put?
Not a regular OBGYN, but some of the ones in the more kind of integrative, holistic world, or midwives will actually do a vaginal swab and kind of inoculate the nose and mouth of the infant with the mother's vaginal secretions after delivery. So that's a kind of nice thing to do. But I always, in those cesarean cases, make sure to use an infant strain probiotic as soon as possible and for a longer period of time to get some of those good microbes kind of seeded and cultivating in the lining. So I use a product called HMF Natogen by Soroil, or I think Genestra is the company, but HMF Natogen. And that's a really excellent compound that can do a lot of good for little infants. And then, of course, quality of mother's breast milk's a really big deal. So having your daughter's kind of, digestive health in order, nutrition really appropriate is going to make that breast milk really conducive to nurturing a better flora for baby's gut.
Okay, so another question, and you may not want to take this one on. Daughter's been vaccinated. Will some of that carry to the baby?
Well,
if you don't want to.
Yeah,
answer,
I mean that's a little bit more.
Okay.
It's a little bit more complex of a question because it really depends on how her immune system uniquely interfaces with that vaccine, which is going to be dependent on just so many different individual variables. So, in general, vaccines elicit a pretty strong immune response, and again, it's unique to the person how adaptive or maladaptive that response can be. So I wouldn't get really meaningfully worried about it as if it definitely will have a destructive, detrimental impact. But it could be a player as a variable in the overall interchange of immune and digestive health. So that. Then one person asked about drinking.
Okay, those are the only questions that I had.
Yeah, go ahead, Randy. Oh, you're done.
Maybe a future session, if you or Dr. Karen could talk about the new vaccine and the science behind it. I don't expect anything today, but
yeah, sure. Actually, you know what? Yeah, I would really recommend to you is if you go to our website, I did a really expansive lecture on this topic that I recorded, and I really feel like it's a very broad, sweeping understanding of our immune system, vaccines. I mean, it's not just only about the vaccine, but there's a huge section that I cover that. So I don't know if I'm going to go repeat that material just because I did do a big kind of sweeping talk on that, I believe, in May. So, and then the other question was drinking water with meals. Well, from a digestive acid concentration of digestive enzymes, I tend to advise people to minimize the amount of fluids they drink with meals, mainly because you dilute those enzymes and acids from really supporting the digestive process. You can have little bits, but I tend to emphasize hydrating between meals versus during. So it's part of my food hygiene handout, which I believe is on our website too. So if there aren't any other questions, I appreciate you all being on this call and look forward to future open forums. Don't ever hesitate to shoot over ideas for future talks too. I'm always open to grabbing something that the patients and community are interested in. So again, thank you very much for being on the call. We'll post this to our website soon, and stay cool in the hot weather. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, Dr.